Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes Ms. Lee for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This has been an incredibly electric hearing. It'd be funny if it weren't real life. I understand my colleagues on the other side of the aisle want to be victims so very badly. But Ms. Navaroli, if I understand you correctly, public criticism and allegations of anti-conservative bias are actually making Twitter and other social media companies less willing to enforce their own policies against political conservatives, correct?
Yes, that was my understanding based on research that was done at Twitter.
Meaning the same Republicans insisting on making themselves a victim is working?
Could you repeat the question?
The same Republicans, folks on this panel, who are insisting on making themselves victims in this conversation about Twitter censorship and other accusations they've made, is this working because of the conservative bias and the implications of it? Or the allegations of conservative bias?
I
In other words, are the allegations of conservative bias making it harder for those in Twitter or those who are working there to enforce these policies against folks who incite hate speech or make it?
Thank you for rephrasing that question, and thank you for asking it. Yes, these allegations are very much having an impact on the leadership within every social media company, as they hope to not receive allegations of being biased or in any way being politically leaning.
Thank you. I'm not the only lawyer in the room, so you all know that while the Constitution does provide us the right to free speech, there are, of course, limitations. As Ms. Navaroli pointed out, we cannot yell fire in a crowded theater. Compromising freedom of speech may seem dangerous until we weigh that compromise against the men and women massacred in Buffalo, for instance, or the many other places where radicalized violent extremists found their motivation to kill on social media. This isn't about oppression. It's about public safety. This isn't about censorship. It's about protecting our democracy from misinformation. Ms. Navaroli, it was your job to decide whether someone was yelling fire in the theater. Could you describe the coded incitement to violence policy Twitter did not implement?
Yes, thank you for that question. The coded incitement to violence policy was an incredibly nuanced policy that was created in order to fill the gaps that were existing in the already existing policies around violence. The policies around violence were explicit. So these were calls that said, I'm going to, I want to, I plan to, I wish to. Those sorts of incitements would have come down. Things like stand back, stand by. Things like I am locked and loaded and ready for a civil war were dog whistles that were not covered underneath the policy.
Thank you. Could it have saved lives if it were implemented on January 5th, 2021, or possibly in November of 2020?
I can't speculate as to what might have happened, and I do wish we would have acted.
Thank you. Ms. Gadde, the very same words that were plastered across Twitter were shouted at the January 6th insurrection. What threats do Americans face now that Elon Musk has removed all guardrails and welcomed back Donald Trump to the platform?
Thank you for the question. I'm actually not really familiar with what the content moderation policies of Twitter are today.
Okay, thank you. Social media platforms like Twitter must own up to their responsibility in spreading violence and chaos. I'd argue so too do members of this panel and institution. Thank you. I yield the balance of my time to Mr. Raskin.
Thank you very much. Mr. Roth, I want to go back to the whole question of your finding hundreds of thousands of fake accounts set up by Vladimir Putin and the Russian Internet Research Agency, I think they called it, which was the propaganda arm in 2016, and I suppose to this day. Some have been suggesting on the other side of the aisle that it's illegitimate for the FBI or any representative of the federal government, presumably even Donald Trump, who did a lot of this, to contact private media entities in order to apprise them of anything, whether it might be the penetration of organized crime or child pornography or foreign malign influence. And I'm just wondering if you would give us a sense of how much work is actually being done, and I was going to check with you and Mr. Baker about that. How much work does Twitter and other social media entities do that relies on the FBI and other national security agencies?
Thank you for the question. there was a considerable amount of work to address foreign disinformation at Twitter and also at other companies. And this work was reliant in part on intelligence shared with companies by law enforcement and by the intelligence community. I would regard that work as essential. At Twitter, we had dozens of people working just on these questions of election interference. Those teams no longer exist under Mr. Musk.
And Mr. Baker, if you could.
Thank you, sir. Just generally, I mean, it's a matter of public record that the FBI has worked with the public, including private entities, for decades. Indeed, they've had for some number of years now an office of, I think it's called Office of Public Sector Engagement. This is part of what they do in order to fulfill their responsibilities and to do their jobs to protect the country.
Thank you. Yield back.
Chair recognizes Mr. Armstrong for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Roth. I'm going to continue down that line of questioning. So when you testified, you were just talking about working very hard to keep foreign troll farms from using Twitter and to engage in malign foreign interference. This sounds like a fairly robust undertaking. You said between 2016 and 2020, you had different teams stood up to do this. Constant vigilance?
Yes, sir. That was the phrase that we used.
Yeah. And these types of attempts are constantly evolving. They're trying to find new ways to penetrate your system, so you have to be engaging with it on a, and being willing to adapt on a constant basis.
Yes, sir. That's right.
And now we forward to 2020, and earlier you had testified that you were having regular interactions with National Intelligence, Homeland Security, and the FBI,
Yes, I did.
and primarily to deal with foreign interference?
Primarily, but I would say
Also
almost
misinformation and all of that.
exclusively.
But you had said earlier, like your contact with Agent Chang was primarily with foreign interference?
Yes, that's right.
All right. And these were emails, were there meetings?
Yes, Twitter met quarterly with the FBI Foreign Interference Task Force, and we had those meetings running for a number of years to share information about malign foreign interference.
Agents from Homeland Security or intelligence, or just primarily the FBI?
Our primary contacts were with the FBI, and in those quarterly meetings, they were, I believe, exclusively with FBI personnel.
And you had multiple former FBI agents on the payroll. I mean, Mr. Baker, you have 10 years experience with FBI, DOJ?
I was, well, with DOJ, it's 2 decades roughly, but I was just, for the record, I was never an FBI agent.
Okay.
Yeah.
And Twitter has such a close relationship with at least one FBI agent that that agent could start emails with, "Hey, Twitter folks," and could actually advise your company about violations of your own terms of service. Mr. Roth, I think it's safe to say that you had a consistent dialogue with the FBI for the weeks and months prior to the New York Post. Is that fair?
I had ongoing conversations with the FBI for years, I would say, about election
And
security.
in response to Mr. Fry earlier, you said you would not categorize the FBI communications as pressure.
No, I would not.
However, Twitter's director of policy wrote to you in 2020 that Twitter has seen a sustained effort by the intelligence community to push Twitter and that Twitter should keep a solid front against these efforts. He specifically cited Elvis Chan, an FBI agent in San Francisco. Now, on August 11th, 2020, Agent Chan sent you 3 documents in prep for a meeting and said the documents pertain to APT-28, a hacking unit connected with Russian military intelligence. Agent Chan arranged for having security clearance for Mr. Baker and facilitated encrypted networks for the FBI to share information with Twitter employees. And on October 14th of 2020, you stated that this feels a lot like somewhat of a subtle leak operation. Earlier today, you testified that you were following national experts on Twitter, national security experts on Twitter, as a reason to take down the New York Post story on Hunter Biden's laptop.
Yes, sir, I did.
So, after 2016, you set up all these teams to deal with Russian interference, foreign interference. You're having regular meetings with the FBI. You have connections with all of these different government agencies, and you didn't reach out to them once?
Is that question in reference to the day of the New York Post
Yeah.
article? That's right. We generally did not reach out to the FBI to consult on content moderation decisions, especially where they related to domestic activity. It's not that we wouldn't have liked that information. We certainly would have. It's that I don't believe it would have been appropriate for us to consult with the FBI.
In December of 2020, you did a declaration to the Federal Election Commission that the intelligence community expected a leak and a hack operation involving Hunter Biden. Recently, Mark Zuckerberg confirmed that the FBI warned Meta that there was a high effort of Russian propaganda, including language specific enough to fit the Hunter laptop Biden security story. You're talking to these people for weeks and months, years prior to this leaking. They have specifically told you in October that there's going to be a leak potentially involving Hunter Biden's laptop. They legitimately and literally prophesized what happened. And you didn't contact any of them?
No, sir, I did not.
Did they reach out to you?
On and around that day, to the best of my recollection, no, they did not.
So after the story was taken down and you guys did it and you personally disagreed with it, Ms. Gaddy, you said you did. Did you contact them and say, hey, is this what you were talking about?
If that question was directed to me, no, I did
Ms.
not
Gaddy,
discuss
did you
that.
talk to anybody from the FBI?
Not to the best of my recollection.
So I guess my question is, what is the point of this program? You have constant communication. They're set up for foreign interference. They've legitimately warned you about this very specific thing, and then all of a sudden everybody just walks away? Like, this is what you planned for. This is what you prepared for. This is the information. They told you exactly what was going to happen, and then you want, I don't care if it's members of Congress, you legitimately want the American people to believe we just completely cut off contact with all of the people who we were supposed to defend against? I don't think it passes the smell test, and neither do the American people. I yield back.
Chair recognizes Mr. Kassar for 5 minutes.
I'm honored to be a new member of Congress, where our purpose is to listen to the people and represent their voices and lift up our communities. After talking to thousands of people across Texas, asking them, what do you want me to work on for you as a new member of Congress? Not a single person told me they were concerned about a New York Post story on Twitter about Hunter Biden. Is that really what we're dedicating this committee's time to? Is that really what we're going to dedicate the next 2 years to? Our constituents of all political backgrounds are worried they're getting pushed out of their neighborhoods by spiking housing costs. They see their public schools suffering because we aren't supporting our teachers. In my state, our rural hospitals are closing. We have more uninsured people than anywhere in the country. We have the highest number of food insecure kids, and reproductive rights have been stripped away. We're talking about none of that. It seems to me that we're having these hearings so that people can beat their chest about Hunter Biden, maybe do some fundraising, get some headlines, and ironically post those on Twitter. If that's what House Republicans want to spend their time on, then that's their prerogative. But to me, it's a damn shame. We're here for a bigger purpose than that. Under the leadership of the legendary chairman, Jack Brooks from Texas, this committee implemented the Great Society through the creation of Head Start and the creation of Medicare. They investigated Watergate. They built the U.S. space program. Anything is possible if we all come together to work on what our constituents demand, if we make sure that we say to our constituents that your voice matters here. We could be ensuring that the historic investments in infrastructure and domestic manufacturing create good union jobs where we need them the most. We could take on free speech and civil liberties issues at home and across the world. We could be investigating and taking a look at these real threats of domestic terrorism and civil unrest. We could be making sure that our constituents' lives are better. But instead, we're focusing today on Twitter. The American people deserve better. I yield back my time to Mr. Raskin.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kassar. Let's go back to this point about the Russian disinformation campaign. And just to refresh everybody's recollection, Mr. Roth, you learned, was it before 2016 or after 2016, that Vladimir Putin had commanded an entire campaign to try to invade the American election with social media messages on Twitter, Facebook, and so on? Was that before the election you learned or after?
While there was some public discussion of it before the election, most of the confirmed information was only declassified after Election Day.
Okay, so there was this powerful, massive campaign unleashed by a malign foreign actor interested in undermining American democracy with a specific electoral objective, right? Did you find that? Was he just trying to create chaos, or did he want to put the thumb on the scale with his intervention for either Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump?
A bit of both, honestly. I think there was a significant amount of the troll activity on social media in particular that wasn't tilted one way or the other. It played both sides and it played them off of each other. And I think that's bad for America and it's bad for democracy. I think the Hack and Leak campaign was a bit more skewed because that focused very specifically on the DNC and on John Podesta.
Okay, and so the Hack and Leak campaign against the DNC and Hillary Clinton was one meant to damage Hillary Clinton's campaign. Is that right?
That's what most research concludes was the objective, yeah.
All right. So some people are suggesting that if the U.S. government finds out about a malign foreign influence disinformation or propaganda campaign in our elections at any level, the government shouldn't say anything to the public or the news media about it. What do you think about that proposition?
I believe that would be a profound failure. I think there's a collective responsibility across the private sector and the public sector to address our shared threats, and Russian interference in American democracy is one of those shared threats.
Okay. Ms. Gaddy, do you agree with that?
Yes, I do.
Okay. And just back to you, Ms. Navaroli, for a moment. Did you follow the attempt to overthrow the official election result in Brazil?
I was not working at Twitter at the time, but I paid attention to the news, yes.
Okay, and were you struck by any of the resemblances between what happened in Brazil and what happened here on January 6th?
Yes, it was the exact same playbook that was played on January 6th, in which a ruling party claimed that an election was stolen, and that misinformation continued to spread and lead to political violence.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Chair recognizes Mr. Fallon for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If there was ever, if there's ever a time where our government becomes the sole arbiter of truth, then we've lost the United States. Twitter's become the virtual town square. It now has the power to transform public opinion like no other medium in history, with their algorithms shaping and molding the public mind to their own ends. Mr. Roth, to the best of your knowledge, what percentage of your colleagues when you worked at Twitter donated to Democratic causes or candidates in 2020?
I don't know, sir.
We have it here. It was 98.4% of Twitter employees gave to Democratic candidates or causes in the 2020 election cycle. And believe it or not, those numbers actually went up in the 2022 cycle to 99.7% of Twitter employees donating to Democratic candidates and causes. So clearly, Twitter as a whole had a political bias. Mr. Roth, do you personally think that you have a political bias, and did you have one when you worked at Twitter? A personal political bias?
No, sir.
You didn't. That's remarkable because it's pretty obvious you did have strong biases when you compared, ironically using Twitter, people that worked in the Trump White House to Nazis. They were good folks that you simply disagreed with politically in our representative republic, and you compared them to the most evil people on the planet that murdered 60 million people, or at least were responsible for those deaths. You think that was a little bit hyperbolic?
Yes, I do. As I said, I regret the language.
I agree with you. It was. And so your political opinion spilled over into censorship work at Twitter. I think your biases had consequences, which you intentionally expressed through your propaganda and censorship role at Twitter. Additionally, you may have collaborated with the U.S. intelligence community regarding stories that y'all didn't want the public to see. So namely, what we refer to as the Hunter Biden laptop story that ran in the New York Post. So I'll ask you, Mr. Roth, did you receive 10 confidential documents from Special Agent of the FBI, Elvis Chan, the night before the Hunter Biden laptop story ran?
Yes.
You did. See, because it's interesting, with the immediacy with which you all acted to censor the New York Post Hunter Biden laptop story seems to be very indicative of foreknowledge. And the story was seismic, and it was rushed to be suppressed, knowing full well it was not Russian disinformation, as some here said. It was truth that was denied the American voter. And the Media Research Center polled Democratic voters in 2020 swing states and found that 17% would have changed their vote if they had known the contents and evidence of the New York Post story. President Trump lost key states, Georgia, Pennsylvania, Arizona, and Wisconsin, by collectively just over 100,000 votes. And if this is accurate, this poll, 3.2 million votes could have swung. And he only needed a teeny fraction of those 3.2 million. That decision almost certainly changed the result of the 2020 presidential election. Did you have any idea the contents of the New York Post story, Mr. Roth?
Only what I read in the New York Post that day.
And then it was killed by Twitter, and the mainstream media followed. So I found this interesting. In 2019, candidate for president Joe Biden said, and I quote, "I have never spoken to my son about his overseas business dealings." And yet, the evidence in that story and on that laptop revealed that two of Hunter's Mexican business associates, Miguel Magnati and Miguel Velasco, visited the White House in February 2014, and he was later photographed. Joe Biden was photographed with him in the White House. Also in October 2015, Hunter arranged a video conference with his dad, Joe Biden, the sitting vice president, and Carlos Slim, the Mexican billionaire. And then unbelievably in 2015, Hunter introduced his father, then vice president, to Vadam Pazarski, an executive at the now infamous Burisma Holdings Company, where Hunter would later magically make millions as a board member despite having no experience whatsoever in the energy sector. Joe Biden lied. He created the firewall, and then he was exposed because of this story and other information. He lied to the American people, and Mr. Roth, you withheld information on the eve of a presidential election, and you protected that lie. And I hope for the sake of the country that men like you that do those things, men and women, never get to put in such power, in positions of power again. And Mr. Chairman, I'd also like to see if, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a tweet from Ranking Member Raskin. The tweet reads, "It's horrifying to see images of Border Patrol agents whipping Haitian refugees at the Texas border. Not exactly the feeling I get from the Statue of Liberty."
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you.
Pajama,
I
you're
yield
back.
back.
Pajama,
Yep. Oh, well, I just think that's misinformation, or at least it was a mistake, and Twitter left it up for a week, or not a week, a year, a full